Hello there, welcome to the Comments, a collaborative project by Espresso Global and Ukrainian media. I'm Olena Solodovnikova, and it's great pleasure for me to be joined by Russian-American historian and writer Yuriy Felshtinskiy. Hello, Yuriy.
Hello.
In the Russian elections, Putin has won with 87% of vote. What does this figure mean for the standards of a dictatorial regime?
Well, if you remember, after they annexed Crimea, they claimed that 86% of Russian population supports annexation of Crimea. This is 2014, of course. So now they decided to increase this percentage slightly, right? I think there is a different formula of understanding what is the level of freedom in Russia. You actually should deduct this percentage from 100, and then you will get what 12.4. That's precisely what's happening, right? And then it's very interesting because if you start to check, for example, Moscow, I'm sure you will see that this percentage is smaller, right? Meaning that there is less support for Putin in places like Moscow, for example, and the highest percentage I'm sure you will get in places like Chechen Republic, which is under Kadyrov, who controls everything in each area. So, and again, this would be the deduction, the same. If you apply the same deduction, you will realize that the level of freedom in the Chechen Republic is, of course, smaller than in places like Moscow. But anyway, look, we know that there are no elections. Indeed, the Soviet Union existed until this similar system until 1991, right? People would come to vote. They will have names printed actually on a bulletin, and they just drop it in a box. And it was like whatever, usually 92% or 96% of support for the Soviet government. Until, of course, in August of 91, the support went to zero level. So suddenly. So we should not pay attention, of course, to these numbers. It is important to understand that Russia is a country where by law, which was introduced several years ago, the computer which calculates votes of people is under the control of the FSB. This is by law. And the FSB is responsible for quote-unquote safety of that computer. And then, of course, recently, although this was probably again like 2-3 years ago, there was a law passed allowing a remote voting system. What is actually, good thing to have. You do not have to travel if you do not want to, especially in places like Russia, where there are some areas there are no roads and distances are huge. But in reality, in today's Russia, this creates a possibility for the government, which is the FSB again, to add votes of those people who indeed did not go to vote for the favorite candidate. So that's why, again, since the FSB controls the computer and controls the counting, and the government, of course, is basically is part of the FSB, or the FSB is part of the government, we have no way to check what the real support of population is, and this again taken into account that there is no freedom of press, that TV is controlled by government, newspapers controlled by government, propaganda level is unbelievably high. So we were not expecting that Putin would lose this elections.
Yes, but it seems to me that this time even a fake election race was created. In particular, the relatively new face, Nadezhdin, was not even registered. Is Putin afraid of that new candidates will become more popular, or he simply does not consider it necessary to work hard?
Well, you see, we should mention, of course, that Navalny was killed prior to elections, and of course he was in prison. He was not participating in those elections, but he was probably the most popular politician if he would be, free, and if he would be allowed to participate. All those ifs never happened, but nevertheless, I'm sure that the idea was to kill him before the election, so people would not start to write down his name in those bulletins. Those people who are in charge of Russia, in addition to everything what we know about them, they are also extremely paranoid, and this is so important for them that they usually try to prevent everything and kill all opponents before the event would come. And this was the case, of course, with the murder of Boris Nemtsov, who was a very popular politician and who, technically speaking, could run for presidency. And then, of course, with Navalny also, he could not run because he was in prison. But for them, this is not enough. For them, the only sure thing is when the person is dead. So it's a long story, unfortunately, because Putin became president, of course, in 2000. But even in 2000, he became president not through really elections, but through manipulation of the constitution, because for this Yeltsin had to resign 4 months before his term expired, well, 5 months technically, probably, and to name Putin acting president of Russia. And then, of course, Putin was kind of, moved from position of acting president to presidency, again through the explosion of apartment buildings in Moscow, through the beginning of the Second Chechen War. We would not call this fair elections, of course. And this was 2000. And then starting 2004, he already ruled in a country which had no freedom of press. In 2003, Khodorkovsky was arrested, Michael Khodorkovsky, and Yukos was destroyed. And this is not, we could say that this is like a business event, but it was not. This was also an indication that all those rich people who have money and who think that they could participate in political activity of Russia actually should not participate, because then their businesses would be ruined, like Yukos company. And then, of course, we know, right? He replaced himself with Medvedev because he could not run for the third term by law, according to Russian constitution. Then he came back to power, although this was very questionable and actually unconstitutional, because in constitution it was said that you could be the president for 2 terms only. Now they pretended after this Medvedev break, he could run again for 2 more terms. Then they changed 4 years to 6 years, and then actually Putin passed a law allowing him to be president until 2036. Everything what I was saying has nothing to do with free elections. I mean, there are no free elections. There are no elections in Russia. I mean,
Yep. By the way, in your opinion, is Medvedev really out of mind, crazy, or is he playing a role of the clone that Zhirinovsky used to play? Because recently Medvedev has articulated some ideas saying that Russia expects from the so-called armistice in Ukraine. Why did he did say that? And that was no like a joke. That was like a really statement.
Well, Zhirinovsky, if you compare him to Medvedev, looks like a liberal-minded person. I think the answer is the following. Well, number one, that's actually, believe it or not, that's what Medvedev was thinking all these years, even when he was prime minister, even when he was the president. It's just he was not, he couldn't allow his, these thoughts to be published or to be said. Now he is like a free person, and he could say about the West and Ukrainians what he was thinking, all his life about these people and about his former colleagues. And I actually, every time I read his texts, which are absolutely incredible, and I just, really would like everybody who wants to understand what's happening in Russia now to read those texts, because he's really outspoken. And again, he's like a free bird. He's flying, without any limits, without any limitations. He's saying what he wants to say finally. And Medvedev is important for us because he's very close to Putin. We know this. So he basically is saying what Putin still doesn't want to say. Well, he's saying, Putin is saying the same, but Putin is trying to limit himself in the amount of words and amount of time when he spends on those interviews. But again, even Putin in the last interviews became more aggressive, when we think about all his interviews where he basically saying that he would nuke the world, right, if it's necessary. But Medvedev is absolutely marvelous, of course, because this is so ridiculous. But what's important to understand that's precisely is the stage of development of the Russian Federation. That's what it is. This is reality. This is not fake. This is not joke. When he published his first text, there were reports that, well, those hackers, then they just, this is not Medvedev. It's impossible. This is not Medvedev. Then he went out saying, well, no, this is me. This is my text. And then, of course, there were publications and people were saying, oh, he's drinking. He probably thought he's not responsible for his words. And I specifically checked the timing of all those texts. This were early morning texts, 9 a.m., 10 a.m., 12 noon. It's not that this is a drunk person who is writing it. He was absolutely sober. No, that's what he thinks, and it helps us to understand with what we are dealing. And the danger is real, the war is real, they're not going to stop with Ukraine. Actually, if you read his text, it's clear that they're not going to stop with Ukraine. They're not going to stop with Moldova, they're not going to stop with the Baltic states and with Poland. They want everything. And when we think that, well, how could a person plans to have everything? It's actually very simple. It happened in history. It happened Well, let's start, and I do not want to go deep into history, but let's start with Napoleon, who had plans which were extreme for Europe of those days. Let's start with continue with the theory of world revolution, which actually included the control of everything by the world communist government. Let's continue with Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, which again presumed that you would have this permanent war until the revolution won all over the world. And then let's look at Stalin, who basically slightly modernized the theory of world revolution and Trotsky permanent revolution, and took half of Europe by 1945 and planned to move further. But the problem was that Americans developed nuclear weapons in 1945, and the Soviet Union didn't have it yet. So Stalin had to stop, and he was extremely unhappy with the results of the Second World War. But the nuclear weapon forced the governments to rethink the reality, and the Soviet government actually came to a conclusion, and this is important, that a nuclear war could not be won. And for this reason, something should replace the old theory of world revolution. And that's how peaceful coexistence appeared. That Americans and the Soviet Union basically agreed that because of nuclear weapons, they should not fight, and they should create a new form of coexistence, right? And we know this as peaceful coexistence. And that's what we had until 1991. When the Soviet Union collapsed. And then Putin, after invasion of Crimea, announced a new theory that actually Russia could win nuclear war. This is an absolutely ridiculous theory and a ridiculous format of existence, but that's what they are selling to population for internal purposes, and that's what they're using for abroad to try to frighten the world. Because if you look at history of the Russian-Ukrainian war, which started on 24th, the full-scale invasion, right, so-called, which started on 24th of February, the plan was not to fight. The plan was to accept capitulation. And they were actually seriously thought that they will accept first capitulation of Ukraine, then they would proceed to Moldova, then they would demand the return of the Baltic states into the new whatever Soviet Union or the old Russian Empire, whatever this is. And then, as Putin actually was saying, they would like to have the return of the influence which the Soviet Union had. Right, and basically he wants, all those countries which joined NATO, to withdraw from NATO. This was the idea, which didn't work because Ukrainians started to fight and because they refused to capitulate. And now all they have after this 2 years of war, which, of course, terrible for the world and first of all for Ukraine, but which didn't go well for Russia and doesn't go well for Russia. All they have is this nuclear bluff. But the question is if this is bluff or not. And of course, there is no answer to this question. And by the way, no one, of course, knows, including Putin, including Medvedev, what this is actually is nuclear war. I mean,
but
what is this? What the world is going during or after the war. I mean, no one actually, not a single person, trust me. And so they're using this, and well, we incline to think that this is bluff. And there is a very good chance that this is bluff, although I'm slightly nervous of the existence of nuclear weapons in Belarus.
Yeah, Beba, I know. I
And
just want to clarify, because previously you predicted that Putin could use nuclear weapon against the EU countries from the Belarus, and that's why he transferred the nuclear weapon here. But was it really necessary from the technical point, or is it intimidation purposes, frightening purposes for the world?
well, precisely, but this is my point. If this would be done for intimidation or to frighten the world, they would move it to Kaliningrad region, because this is still the territory of the Russian Federation. So the question is, why do you move it? And Kaliningrad, by the way, is strategically positioned quite well for this purpose, because from Kaliningrad you could reach Portugal even without any difficulties, while from Belarus, it's still far away. So the question is, why you move nuclear weapons to a foreign country? Technically speaking, or they're saying that, well, we control it. That's true, because they are not allowed to give it to Belarus, because the agreement which they signed in 2010, I believe, right? But nevertheless, this creates a possibility of nuclear strike from Belarus, not from the Russian Federation. And the calculation might be that the retaliation in this case would be against Belarus and not against the Russian Federation, while, of course, the strike goes against Europe. And this scenario especially becomes very serious if we consider the possibility of Trump winning elections in November of this year and withdrawing from European affairs on the 21st of January of 25, as he so far promises to do, because in this case, Europe would lose the nuclear umbrella of the United States. And then the Belarusian factor, when nuclear weapons are in Belarus, fighting against just two nuclear countries in Europe, France and Great Britain, becomes a factor. So that's why I became the date was announced that Russia was planning to move nuclear weapons to Belarus. I became very nervous about this, not because nuclear weapons were moved closer to Europe. This doesn't really important from a sort of the point of view of distance, but because they probably were preparing for this hybrid kind of nuclear war and
do something without their hands. Yep.
So this is not Russia. These are not Russians. Those weapons were kidnapped by Ukrainians or by terrorists, and we are not responsible, etc., etc., etc. That's what I am afraid of.
But now Ukrainians use the technique. There are no us here. I mean, how do you feel about the actions of Russian militias groups that have seized some Russian regions? And why wasn't their offensive, wasn't there quickly suppressed?
Well, Russia is a very strange country. In many ways, it is a strange country. And just another strange thing about Russia is that this is a huge country, but this is a country of one city. And this city is capital of the country. So in 1917, it was, Petrograd. Today, it is Moscow. And fortunately or unfortunately, because indeed I would say that fortunately, everything depends on one city in Moscow. So Ukrainians are not able to advance into Moscow, of course, and they do not need to, honestly. But what they have to do, and I'm saying this for some time, they of course have to strike against Moscow. So personally, I think that, I mean, it sounds great that, you know, the Russian troops which are opposing Putin's regime are entering Russian territory from Ukraine and fighting in Belgorod district or region. But I think it doesn't matter. I think what is matter is Moscow, and Putin actually does not care if there is a fighting, you know, along the Russian-Ukrainian border. Again, as long as Moscow is safe. So I think that's what not Ukrainians, because Ukrainians would do it tomorrow if they would have opportunity to strike against Moscow. They do not have weapons to do this, and I think what should be done, and I guess everybody knows what should be done. What should be done is that Ukrainians should get from the West all weapons they need to fight this war and to win this war. And for 2 years, unfortunately, the West helps Ukraine, but at the same time does everything what is in their power not to allow Ukrainians to win this war. And if, you know, this war might be over in 2 weeks, a long time ago, and it might be over in 2 weeks now if Ukrainians will get what they need from the Western, you know, alliances and strike against Moscow. Then this war will be over, because that's the only thing which Putin, his regime, his government, whatever, would not survive. The rest doesn't really matter. The half of the country could go underwater tomorrow. No one will, you know, the Russian TV will not report about this, and no one would notice about this. They are not drafting, for example, people from Moscow into army for a reason, right? They do not draft people from St. Petersburg into army for the same reason, right? They want those cities to be safe. And if you talk to Russian citizens living in those cities, and they're still traveling, or they're still in Europe, they're still in the United States, they're explaining you honestly that they nothing is happening, that they do not really feel this war. Indeed, this is not a war. This is a certain activity, you know, which is conducted far away in Ukraine. And Moscow lives as if nothing happens. You know, people go to concerts, to exhibitions, to restaurants, to cafes, and nothing is happening. Nothing changed. And many of those people, by the way, explain you that indeed life is better now because salaries are higher, no unemployment, you know, no crime because everybody is afraid of everything. So that's what the problem is. So Belgorod, you know, could be destroyed tomorrow, but this will not change the course of the war. The strikes against Moscow will.
Okay, but in this case, if Putin doesn't matter about the small cities, can Ukraine claim to annex the captured cities and villages, referring to the fact that the cities belonged to the Ukraine about 100 years ago, for example, Belgorod and some Kuban regions, towns? Who do take their territory?
No, I understand. But, you know, we know that Ukrainians are civilized people and they're not going to change the borders established after 1991, right? No one plans to do this except for Russia. And that's how this aggression started, right, with Putin's idea to recreate the old Soviet Union or something similar to the old Soviet Union. And that's where it's going to end, of course, because he would not be able to do this. But unfortunately, we are dealing with people again. We are dealing with people who came to rule this country on behalf of the FSB. Indeed, the Russian Federation is the only country where the state security is running the entire country. This actually never happened in world's history. This just never happened. We had, monarchs, dictators, political parties running countries, but state security would never run a country. And in Russia, this happened in 2000, and they are running this country without any political control. In the Soviet Union, again, KGB was very powerful, as we know, but they had political control of the Communist Party. Since 91, of course, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Communist Party basically stopped to exist and to have monopoly for political power, the KGB since 2000 is running this country without any political control. That's why Russia is the only country in the world where political parties are not fighting for presidency, for example. I mean, even today, right, in this election, so-called, these are just, some private individuals, right, which would compete with Putin, quote unquote, but no political parties. Political parties are all, basically they cease to exist. They are very weak, and this was done on purpose so they would not compete with the FSB for power. The only serious power in Russia is the FSB, and so that's why we have all this first misunderstandings with Russia, because European leaders actually could not figure out what's actually happening, what's going on in this strange country under the name Russia, which was always strange and always complicated. Well, we should talk to them, we should listen them, we should pay attention to what they want, and indeed, somehow it worked for Russia. You see, when Putin is saying that the collapse of the Soviet Union is the greatest geopolitical catastrophe and tragedy for Russian people, and he's thinking about, fixing this, everybody's listening somehow. Well, maybe he has a point. Maybe we should, discuss his problems. If the King of England would state tomorrow that the collapse of British Empire is a major geopolitical catastrophe and tragedy for British people, and he would like to get back the United States and India, Britain's probably would send him to a mental hospital, right?
But
if Erdogan would state tomorrow that the collapse of the Ottoman Empire is the greatest geopolitical catastrophe for Turkish people, and he would like to rebuild his empire back, right? No one would discuss this. But when Putin is saying that, well, actually, Ukraine is part of Russia, there is no such country, there is no such people, there is no such language, everybody is seriously discussing, well, is there a point here? Should we look into history? Is Ukraine real? Are Ukrainians exist? Is the language actually the same or different? That's unfortunately what provoked this conflict, if we think about Western reaction. But on practical level, of course, the invasion of 2008 of Georgia, which was unnoticed actually provoked this war, the invasion of 2014 and annexation of Crimea, which basically was allowed, provoked this war. So this war could be stopped many times. And as a historian, looking back, looking back at the history of First World War, Second World War, looking back, you understand that there was, some clever moves, simple moves to stop the tragedy. Somehow it's never done, and unfortunately, I'm afraid it's not going to be done even now, because again, instead of thinking about moving NATO troops into Ukraine, what was very nice of Macron to mention, right, because this indicates that at least he now realizes that this war is very serious. You should just give Ukrainians what they need to win this war, because the Ukrainian army, after 2 years of experience with all
Absolutely.
those losses, right, is the most professional army in Europe, and you could not. I mean, NATO troops are great, of course, but Ukrainians are fighting much better. Just give them weapons. It's so simple. And again, this should be done on 24th of February, but it's not too late even now. But at one point, it might be too late again for two reasons. One, we have this great danger coming in the form of Donald Trump, and two, the longer this was continuing, more people are killed, of course, and we are becoming more and more cynical because of this. And we accept the reality, today's reality, which is much worse than it was a year ago, or 2 years ago, or 3 years ago. And 3 years ago, no one would seriously discuss the possibility of nuclear war in Europe. This would be a ridiculous discussion. I mean, people would say, well, are we crazy? Why are we discussing nuclear war in Europe? I mean, it's ridiculous, right? Today we are discussing, well, Putin is saying, well, we will nuke you, and Macron is seriously saying that, well, we have nuclear weapons as well, we will respond, right? We will retaliate. So we now, after 2 years of this war, we really have a discussion whether we will have nuclear war in Europe or will not have nuclear war in Europe. How nice.
Yes.
But this is the result of this war, which Europe unfortunately allowed Putin, well, Europe and the United States, right, unfortunately allowed Putin to have, while he should be stopped immediately, or on the 24th of February. Indeed, I would argue, of course, that he could be even stopped on the 23rd of February, that we easily could prevent this war. All we would have to do is move NATO troops to Ukraine before the war as a response to so-called Belarusian joint military exercises in Belarus, because it was clear that those troops are moved to Belarus to invade Ukraine. So all you had to do to prevent this war is response the same way, like announcing joint military exercises between Ukrainian troops and NATO troops. And Putin probably, I mean, there is no proof, but probably Putin would not invade. But again, I'm thinking and talking as a historian now. Well, it's very easy for me to be a historian of a war. But even today, again, the way to win this war is the way it was 2 years ago, just to give Ukraine everything Ukraine needs and allow them to strike against the territory of the Russian Federation, because you cannot win a war if you are not allowed to strike with modern weapons against your enemy. This is just impossible, even in theory, if possible. So that's why instead of strikes against Moscow with contemporary missiles, we see the invasion of kind of small troops of Russians, right, who are trying to free Belgorod.
Yes, and what are the chances that the West will consider the results of elections illegitimate due to the numerous violations, for instance, the ability to vote using the Ukrainian passport, the LNR passport, that is some kinds of lioness, they use it and vote for Russian president. What do you think about that?
Well, this is a kind of trick, right? That's what Germans were doing, by the way, when they had the same idea, the same slogan, uniting all Germans in the borders of one state, right? And so what Russia was doing and is doing, they are issuing passports to citizens of other countries. Well, those who are, of course, ready to got those passports. So they are issuing Russian passports to citizens of, for example, inhabitants of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia prior to invasion, because then you claim that you're invading because you need to defend Russian citizens living in another country. Right, that's what they were saying in 2008. That's what they're doing in Moldova now. They already issued, as Dmitry Medvedev, by the way, said in one of his texts, that they issued 220,000 Russian passports. These are mainly, of course, inhabitants of Transnistria. This is a region of Moldova which traditionally where Russians are living, but then the idea is that, of course, as soon as they reach by land the borders of Transnistria, they would organize a war similar to the Ukrainian one in Moldova. So that's why they are striking against Odessa, right? Because they have this idea to move to Moldova, to cut Ukraine from the Black Sea completely, and to proceed to Moldova. And they're doing the same in eastern Ukraine. They were doing this since 2014, probably even earlier. That's why those passports are important, because again, with Russian citizens living quote unquote abroad, right? They always have this claim that they're invading to defend Russian citizens living in like the Baltic states, for example, right? In Moldova, in Ukraine. Nothing new. Stalin was actually, when Stalin invaded Poland on 17th of September 1939, the claim was that they are liberating Ukrainians and Belarusians living in eastern Poland. So this is the old trick, but which we easily would ignore, except that it's happening, that they're invading countries, like country after country, and this is the plan. And by the way, again, if we read Medvedev text, what he's saying, and Putin was saying the same, but Medvedev is doing this in better way for us to understand that we are not going to stop, we are not going to go back, and if it takes us dozens of years to destroy Ukraine, we will fight for dozens of years. So they're in a stage of permanent war. The Russian economy actually slightly reformed itself. And in this format, they are able to conduct this war, permanently. This is unfortunately again what we are dealing with. The Russian economy is supplying the Russian army with ammunition. If they do not have enough, they get it from Iran and from North Korea. China, of course, is reimbursing North Korea for everything what is sent to Russia. Indeed, this is China which is sending weapons to Russia in reality. And ruble is not doing great, but nevertheless, it's comparatively stable. So, and again, Russia is a country where the government historically doesn't care how many people are killed, and Putin is ready to lose in this war as many people as necessary. He doesn't care. He doesn't care, and historically, Russia usually would lose millions of people in wars. And people do not care. I mean, life is very cheap in Russia.
Yes, unfortunately, of course, at the end, I wanted to ask you about the death of Alexei Navalny. And Putin claims that he agreed to the exchange Navalny a few days before his death in a prison colony. Why he make his statement and why he mentioned Navalny by the name at the first time? What does it mean?
I think the intention was to kill him, not to release him or to exchange him. And we know that they were trying to kill him in 2020, and this was for them like unfinished operation. So they arrested him, of course, as soon as he came back to Russia after recovery in Germany. They sentenced him to a very long term. And what's important, I think, to understand is that they were worsening his conditions in prison every other month. They are moving him from one prison into another, and that other prison every time would be worse than the previous one. So indeed, they were trying to kill him. I mean, I do not know if he was killed, technically speaking, or whether he died of quote-unquote natural causes in prison, in colony. But the idea was that sooner or later his body simply would not be able to survive the conditions and would die. And that's probably precisely what happened. So I do not know if they really discuss the exchange of Navalny, probably for Krasikov, who was sentenced in Germany for the murder of a Chechen immigrant. But as we know, they did not intend to leave him alive. And you see, if you look at Skripal's, for example, story, he was exchanged. I mean, Skripal was exchanged. This was the Russian government which sent Skripal abroad in exchange for somebody else, right? And then they killed him anyway. Well, they, technically speaking, maybe did not kill him, but we did not see him since the poisoning, and this is an indication that he is not in a good, in good conditions. Now, I do not know if he is alive or not, but even if they would exchange Navalny, they would kill him anyway. Abroad,
yeah. But
another classic.
yes.
So,
but do you think that? As for me now, Yulia Navalny has been officially chosen for represented Russian opposition movement, and can she cope with this role without any political experience?
Well, I was And I am skeptical about possibilities of Russia to deal with Putin with internal forces. I think there is no opposition is not strong enough. Indeed, it's extremely weak. It's basically non-existent. In Russia, there are no political parties which are against Putin and his regime. There are no organizations which are against this regime. Russia in a state of war now, and this regime would be taken down only by force, by people with who are armed, right? And in Russia, the only three groups of people who are armed are the army, of course, the FSB, and uh, Rosgvardia, right, which is kind of internal army organized by Putin for himself. So, and all those structures are, are supporting Putin, and I do not expect them to revolt against Putin and his regime, because this is their regime. I mean, they were building it since 2000, and since the borders are open, the majority of people who are opposing Putin left Russia. And this is important to understand, because if those borders would be closed, then we could expect, the opposition to become stronger and stronger and stronger within those borders, and who knows, maybe that opposition would become powerful in terms of amount of people who are against the government. But as we know, all those people are involved. They live abroad because for a good reason. They understand that it's impossible to fight against this regime, that it's very risky, and there is a good chance that you might be killed in the process, or put in prison in the process. And facing a choice like this, people prefer to emigrate. So that's why I think the only way, unfortunately, to change regime in Russia is to defeat Russia in the war, since this war might continue for some time, and since this war might escalate as well. I think at the end, of course, we will win. I do not know when, and I do not know at what cost. But you see, looking again as a historian at the history of Second World War, we know that it took Germany approximately 75 years to become a normal country. In other words, we would have, after this war, we would have to wait until all people who were born and lived during this war would die, and only after this, probably Europe, and first of all Ukrainians, would forgive Russia for this war. So I think it's too early to try to think and to build new Russia now. I think this time will come, but this time will come only after Russia is defeated in this war. And that's the objective. That's the goal now, to defeat Russia, not to try to reform Russia now. This is impossible. Not to try to reform Russia within the system which already exists in Russia since 2000. This is impossible. We have to concentrate now on defeating Russia. And again, the best way for Europe, by the way, and for the world to defeat Russia is to help Ukrainians to defeat Russia. Then everything will start to heal slowly, but not before Russia is defeated, because they will never stop. As Dmitry Medvedev, thank you very much, explained to us in Russian, his brilliant Russian language, right? That they will not stop. They will not stop. And as he said, well, if we are not able to win, then we will destroy the entire world, right? Because who needs to live in a world if we are not able to win? But that's what we should take into account, and we of course should defeat Russia again, because we have no choice. Not because we would like to, but because we have no choice. Because Putin doesn't leave us the choice.
Yep, excellent. Thank you for sharing time with us. I hope you join us next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.